Hello, everybody. It's Big Cheds. I'm back with another chapter of my battles with cancer, a candid patient and caregiver's memoir. This is my story fighting cancer, surviving cancer, and then taking care of my mom immediately afterwards when she was diagnosed with cancer. I write about my story to help me understand what I went through, but also to help other people. And I published my book on Amazon, along with my other two books, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. Of course, I'm Big Cheds on Twitter. But I want the book to be free, so I'm doing it one chapter at a time on YouTube at Cheds Trading. And that's what this is. So let's, last time we finished up part 2, what's going on with mom. We're in the final part of the book, and this is the hardest part for me to read. So I'm going to kind of fight my way through it. This is the darkest part of the book, but it's important and we're going to do it. So I don't think you understand how serious it is. Wednesday, after 3 more days had passed, my sister called me and she told me that mom was still not ready to be discharged and was showing signs of confusion. She asked me if I could drive into the hospital and sit with her to help her return to normal. And of course, I agreed. For the last few days, I'd been just waiting for a phone call from mom asking me to drive in and pick her up. And as a result, I had not been spending time at the hospital with her, and I was a little bit out of touch as to her condition. My sister believed that mom was having trouble getting acclimated to a day and night cycle after spending so much time in the hospital, and she wanted me to be there and to help keep her awake until it was nighttime, and then she could go to sleep naturally. I was a little startled at the tone of my sister's voice because she seemed worried. She had mentioned that if we did not get mom back on track, she might not get out of the hospital at all. And I did not know what to make of that cryptic comment. About 40 minutes later, I arrived at the hospital and found mom resting peacefully and receiving a Reiki session. Ever so quietly, I took a seat in the corner of the room while a younger Indian lady stood by the bed and laid her hands upon mom, presumably sending mom positive energy. It was extraordinarily emotional for me to see mom laying there and looking much weaker than I had remembered, and I just could not wait for this woman to leave so I could spend some time with mom. When the Reiki session was over and we finally had some privacy, I moved my chair closer and I grabbed mom's hand. And I tried to speak with her as we normally would, and she was physically there, but she could not follow along with the conversation. And that made me sad as I was yearning to connect with her. And seeing mom this way also made me feel guilty for not coming earlier to spend time with her. And that's why I felt at least partially responsible for her getting off track. At that moment, I realized that I needed to be with her more, starting immediately. Everything else I had been working on would be pushed to the side. Mom and I have always had such a close relationship, and she's always fed off of my energy. So I took pride in and gained a purpose from the idea that I could help her to recover. For the next few hours, I sat with her lovingly, showing her pictures on my phone and talking with her about what her granddaughter had been up to that last week. And as I sat with mom, I sent updates to my sister about her condition. And based on my sister's responses, I could tell just how concerned she was. Towards the middle of my stay, I looked over at the monitor and I saw that mom's oxygen level seemed really low, and I pointed that out to the nurse. The nurses responded by giving mom 2 liters of oxygen, and that seemed to make her feel a little bit more comfortable. Mom also started breathing better as a result, and she sat up, and that made conversation a little bit easier, and she also seemed less confused. Mom expressed to me in that moment that she felt as if she had been through quite an ordeal over the last few weeks, and she was looking forward to getting out of the hospital and back to a normal routine. And she also acknowledged that she was still in significant pain, and she said that the doctors had a lot to sort out in regards to her medical condition before they could discharge her. With being realistic about the prospect of an extended hospital stay, Mom asked me to bring one of my daughter's stuffed animals with me on my next visit, and that way she could hug it while she was laying there and recovering. Thursday. The following morning, I returned to the hospital to visit Mom, and I brought with her what I thought to be the perfect stuffed animal, an ultra soft brown and black striped miniature giraffe that Mom gleefully gave the name Snuggles. Mom's eyes lit up when I presented it to her. She drew it closer and placed it under her chin to rest her head upon. Seeing Mom looking so happy was a wonderful moment, and I knew that she would think of my daughter, her granddaughter, as she laid there and recovered. It had not always been easy for Mom to rest comfortably in her hospital room, as she had a series of noisy neighbors from the first day she arrived. And eventually my sister decided to intervene and worked with the doctors behind the scenes to move her to a more private room. And a little while later, we were notified that a room had been made available on a different floor. So a team of orderlies showed up to transport her there. We watched as they ever so carefully wheeled her bed out of the door and down the hall towards the elevator, and I followed along and jumped in beside her for the ride. Once I walked out of the elevator and I looked around, I started to notice some familiar signs on the wall, and then I realized this was the exact same floor of the hospital where I had spent 5 days before Christmas, when I had cancer and fell ill. All those familiar safety signs and other visual cues like the staff recognition posters made that hospital floor feel a little bit like home, and that gave me the sense that we were in the right place. It was so powerful for me to reconnect with that place once again, all the while knowing that Mom was going to be staying right where I had been. I prayed that Mom would receive the same healing power I had while I was there. Mom was finally brought over to her new room, and I was stunned to find out that it was just 3 doors from where I had stayed. What did it mean that I had found myself back again there so soon? After settling Mom into her new bed, the nursing staff ran a new set of basic tests, like taking her vital signs and probing her mental state. And Mom was extremely proud that she knew what day it was. And she was doing her best to stay in the moment, even as so many things around her kept changing. All while this was going on, I continued to coordinate with my sister, and I gave her reports on Mom's condition, most especially about her oxygen level. It was a great comfort to know that my sister was so closely involved and was doing everything she could to make sure that Mom was well taken care of. I know just how much Mom appreciated it as well, and she often remarked to the nursing staff just how lucky she was to have a daughter who was a doctor. My sister also came and sat with Mom for a large part of that day and took away time from her already extremely busy work schedule just to make sure that we were keeping Mom on track for recovery. Again, our goal was to help Mom through her immediate health issues so she could become strong enough to return home. Then she could rest with me before starting another round of immunotherapy treatment. The most pressing issue that we were dealing with now was the inflammation in her lungs. And that inflammation was causing her breathing problems. And unfortunately, the source of this inflammation was still a mystery. Now that they were more concerned about this breathing issue, the doctor had started to give her some steroids, but that would take some time to see if they helped. In the meantime, they were running some other tests, including a CT scan and a complete blood workup. The doctors believed she might have contracted a blood infection, but they were not sure what kind, so they were giving her a generic antibiotic. And they were also planning to perform another test called ERCP to see what was going on with her digestive tract. According to WebMD, ERCP, short for endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, is a procedure used to diagnose diseases of the gallbladder, biliary system, pancreas, and liver. My sister came by for a little while and brought with her her son, the newest addition to the family, and she wanted him to spend some quality time with Grandma. It was wonderful to see 3 generations of our family together, and she and I both took some photos to commemorate the occasion. My sister also had done a little bit of research, and she brought with her a list of questions to ask a loved one towards the end of their life. The questions were such as, what are some of your favorite memories from growing up? And what are some of the favorite places you traveled to? And what do you want people most to remember about you? As my sister read off a list of questions and paused for Mom to answer, I was sad to see that Mom was having trouble responding and for the most part was still confused. The whole experience made me realize that we should have been asking her these questions months beforehand. It made me incredibly sad, and it reinforced the idea that we had underestimated the seriousness of Mom's medical situation. It was getting late now, and I wanted to continue spending time with Mom, so I let my wife know that I would be staying at the hospital that night. And before my sister left, we had a talk just outside the hospital room, and she made it clear to me that we were facing an extremely serious crisis. And if we did not get on top of Mom's oxygen situation, she would not make it much longer. I told my sister that her oxygen level seemed stable to me, and it was the same level as it had been that morning. My sister clued me into the fact that the nurses had to increase Mom's oxygen input from 2 liters to 6 liters just to keep her functioning, and they could not keep raising it any longer. That information from my sister absolutely terrified me, as I could not imagine losing Mom. I had no idea the situation was so dire. Mom seemed so incredibly strong to me, and I'd always believed that we were going to win this fight. So I was just shocked by what my sister had so bluntly said to me. As we wrapped up our conversation, my sister made me promise to keep her updated on Mom's condition that night, and then she left to go have some rest. That evening, I sat with Mom as she rested, and I scrolled through my phone to find more images of happy times to show her and to reminisce. Mom warmly smiled each time I showed her a picture, reacting to some, like Thanksgiving at her place, more than others. And she had a really strong reaction to the photos of our most recent trip to the symphony. And I reminded her of how beautiful the music and singing were, and just how wonderful it was to share that experience with her. After we finished looking at pictures, I played her some soothing classical music from my phone, many of the same selections from that same symphony we had attended only a few months prior, when it seemed like everything was going to be okay. A little while later, Mom and I started to talk again, and she mentioned just how much she was looking forward to getting out of the hospital and back to my house. Sadly, I had to explain to my mom that my sister was worried that she might not get out of the hospital at all, and that things were a lot more serious than we had originally thought. A strange look came upon Mom's face as she absorbed what I had said. I saw a mix of fear and confusion, and then Mom looked at me lovingly and candidly, confiding that we had once again underestimated the power of cancer, as we had so many times before. Initially, we both thought that the cancer was only in her stomach, but we later found out that it was also in her lungs. And then we thought the chemotherapy was working and the tumors were shrinking, but we found out that the chemotherapy had stopped working. Then we thought the immunotherapy would buy us some more time, and here we were, desperately running out of options. Now our back was against the wall, and Mom was fighting for her life. I told her that she was incredibly strong and that we were going to beat this disease together, giving her my word. I also reminded her that she had wonderful and amazing medical care and that the doctors were going to figure out whatever was going on with her. I did, however, have to admit that we had indeed underestimated cancer once again. After talking for a little bit, Mom started to fall asleep, so I prepared to do the same. The wonderful, absolutely wonderful nursing staff provided me with some sheets, blankets, and a pillow so I could lay down in the reclining chair next to her bed and still be close to Mom. And I set up that chair so I could hold her hand while laying down and still be able to see the oxygen monitor. And this monitor was the absolute focal point of my attention. I was not sure if I was going to get much sleep at all that night, so I continued to watch this monitor extremely closely. My emotions were buoyed or sunk with each tick up and down on that machine. Like a laser, I was focused on her heart rate and her oxygen level, and an alarm on the machine would go off when either of those numbers strayed from normal parameters. Throughout the night, when her oxygen level started to go down more than 2 or 3 digits, I would panic, absolutely panic, and an incredibly desperate feeling of things spiraling out of control rapidly grew inside of me. And that feeling of panic would remain until the nurses repositioned Mom's head and her upper torso into more of a sitting position to make it easier for her to breathe. And then her numbers would go back up a little bit. As the night went on and I tried to sleep, but I was constantly interrupted by nurses coming in and taking Mom's vital sign and giving her pain medication. And every hour or two, I would send my sister updates about how Mom was doing, reporting on her oxygen, her heart rate, and her comfort level. And throughout the course of the night, unfortunately, the nurse had to keep turning up the oxygen level to keep Mom stable. We were fast running out of time as Mom approached the maximum amount they could administer before moving on to more drastic and dangerous measures. When morning finally came around, activity started to pick up, and a whole new round of doctors started to show up to check on Mom and to update us with their thoughts on her condition. They reported that they had drained some fluid from her lungs, but there was still more left, and they planned on giving her medication for that. They also told us that her liver function had started to return to normal. And that was great news. So I eagerly relayed to Mom that we finally had something to celebrate. Up until now, Mom had often reflected that she had been receiving bad news after bad news, and all she wanted was to see that trend break. Just before noon, my wife brought our daughter to the hospital so we could all spend some time with Grandma. The last time my mom and my daughter were together, they were giggling and playing card games at my house. And that's when Mom seemed to be on the road to recovery. Now, we were potentially facing the end of the line for Mom, and it looked like my daughter would not be able to enjoy getting to know her grandmother growing up. That felt like a tragedy, to put it mildly. At the present moment, that fact made me as sad as anything else, as my mom was so gifted with children and was an amazing grandmother. My daughter jumped right up on the bed and gave Grandma a hug and kiss and told her that she hoped she could get better soon. It was so touching to see that. And as I had been worried about how my daughter would take seeing Grandma in the hospital in this condition, as that visit continued on, we took pictures to commemorate the occasion, and we shared stories until it was time for Mom to take a little break and to rest. By early afternoon, Mom's close friends started to show up, one after another, and I spent a little time talking with each of them before they went in to visit with Mom, and it was clear to me just how much Mom had meant to these people. I could see it in their faces, and I was so happy that they were able to spend time with Mom on what to many seemed like might be Mom's last day here on Earth. Some of her friends stayed longer than others, and by early afternoon, my aunt had arrived as well, which was great news. My aunt and I have always been so close, and I knew just how much she cared for Mom, and so having her there was a huge boost emotionally. She told me that she planned to stay for the full duration of Mom's hospital visit and that I should go home and rest after having been there for so long. And I was really conflicted about leaving, but Mom seemed to be a little bit more stable than she had been before, and I still had hope that she would be alive when I planned to return the next day, so I obliged. Not knowing if I was going to see her again, with tears in my eyes, I said goodbye to Mom, and it was not easy, to say the least. I felt the warmth of her hand as I held it to my face, and then I kissed it before whispering into her ear. Wanting Mom to feel loved, I told her how strong she was and how wonderful a mother she had always been. Then I told her I was proud of watching her fight. And I told her that I was going to live my life in a way that made her proud. I was beyond overwrought with emotion, and I was physically exhausted as I kissed her on the forehead one final time before walking out the door. It felt incredibly weird to leave the hospital with Mom still inside, as I had been hyper-focused on her for the past few days. I had essentially forgotten about the world outside. I wanted to be there with her to help her in whatever way I could, but I was just too tapped out, and I had to listen to my body and soul, both of which were telling me to rest. My wife picked me up, and as we drove home, I was completely silent for the most of the ride. I broke that silence at one point when I looked up at the sky, and I saw the clouds in the shape of an angel, glowing magnificently as they were backlit from the sun, and this image stunned me. It looked so beautiful and felt divine. After enjoying the moment, I pointed out the cloud formation to my wife, and I told her that perhaps it was a sign that the angels were coming to take Mom. I really wanted to believe that was a possibility, but I was so jaded and demoralized from watching Mom suffer that I could not completely shed my sense of skepticism. Once I was home, I was absolutely exhausted, and my mind was still racing from the events of the prior days, and I needed to find some way to distract myself. So I turned on a documentary, World War II in color. Mercifully, I was able to lose myself for a little while, and I took a break from the raw and jagged reality of Mom's condition, especially from the torture of watching her slowly die. As I laid there in bed watching this documentary, and from time to time I would phase in and out of various states of consciousness. When my thoughts returned to Mom, I was forced to pause the documentary so I could let out some emotion. Completely overwhelmed with grief and stricken with fear and in absolute panic for what was to come next, I felt as if I were in free fall. In my moments of torment, I kept coming back to one thing. If not for what was happening to Mom, I would not know about my genetic disorder. This is just the way I'm hardwired. Even in what was the worst possible scenario, I was searching for and found a tiny morsel of a silver lining. And that mental framework allowed me to calm down just enough to resume watching the documentary. As I prepared for bed that night, I sat with my phone set my phone on the table by my bed, and I continued to check it every few minutes. My sister promised to update me if Mom's status changed. Eventually, my fatigue overtook me, and I was able to fall asleep despite everything that was going on, and that was a welcome respite because I was afraid I would not get any rest at all. What had been keeping me up was a sense of guilt about trying to sleep, thinking that it was selfish of me to feel safe and comfortable enough to doze off, given that Mom was barely hanging on. Saturday. About 4 o'clock that morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing, and my sister told me to hurry into the hospital, as Mom seemed to be getting worse. Hanging up, I immediately woke up my wife, and we rushed into the hospital. The whole drive there, I was silent, focused completely on thinking about the unimaginable prospect of losing my mother. When we arrived, the whole family was there waiting for me, underscoring just how serious a situation we had found ourselves in. My sister let me know that Mom was having a lot of trouble breathing that morning, and the doctors were working aggressively to stabilize her, but they were running out of options. They also confirmed that Mom did have an infection, and they were trying to treat it with antibiotics, but they believed this was a separate issue and not the source of her breathing problems. As for the breathing problems, Mom was suffering from a condition known as ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. According to the Mayo Clinic, acute respiratory distress syndrome occurs when fluid builds up in the tiny elastic air sacs in your lungs. This fluid keeps your lungs from filling with enough air, which means less oxygen reaches your bloodstream. This deprives your organs of the oxygen they need to function. Many people who develop ARDS do not survive. The risk of death increases with age and severity of illness. Of the people who do survive ARDS, some recover completely while others experience lasting damage to their lungs. The doctors were still not sure what was causing Mom's breathing problems, but it was clear to me as a layman that if they did not solve it quickly, she would not survive. After leaving the meeting with my family members, I went right into the room and I sat with Mom, and I found her to be, in my view, pretty similar to the way I left her the night before. And that was great to see, as others had told me that her condition was deteriorating. My presence has always been a calming one for Mom, and with that in mind, I took my responsibility as a caregiver quite seriously, and I wanted to do whatever I could do to help her relax and feel better. Once I settled into the chair next to Mom, I played her some of my favorite oboe sonatas while stroking her hand, hoping to lower her heart rate. I also tried a guided meditation technique, telling her a story about gently floating down a river and hearing the sounds of birds flying overhead. Hoping to soothe her spirit, I told her that she could feel the warmth of the water as she dipped her hand into it, and she could smell the fresh air around her. She could taste the glorious sunshine as she melted away into the beautiful nature around her. As I sat with Mom and did my best to be a supportive son, I was running through various stages of grief, of anger, guilt, fear, denial, and confusion. I was in grief over the pain Mom was suffering. I was angry. I was so angry that the cancer was attacking her. I was guilty that I had not done a better job of taking care of her in the past. I was fearful of losing Mom and what my life would look like afterwards, and I was in complete denial that she was actually in as serious a condition as she was. And I was for sure confused as to how we had found ourselves in this position to begin with. It all seemed so completely unfair to me. I simply did not understand how things had spiraled out of control so fast to the point where Mom was not expected to even make it through the day. First, one day they'd found a tumor in her belly, and not too soon thereafter, the chemotherapy stopped working. Fast forward to now, she was about to die from respiratory failure. Thinking long and hard about my feelings of guilt, I realized that these feelings were wrapped up in a false illusion of control. If I could blame myself for Mom's rapidly degenerating health, that would imply that I was in control rather than the cancer. If I could believe that I was at some point in command of our destiny, then I would not have to fear the cancer being in command. Of course, I was completely wrong, but I at least understood in part why I was feeling guilty. It was so incredibly difficult to maintain my composure while thanking Mom for all the time she spent with my daughter. also for how well she took care of me when I had cancer. Wanting Mom to know just how much she was cherished, I reminded her that all her friends had come to see her and that all her family was there with her, surrounding her with love. And filled with gratitude, I also made sure to tell Mom many times just how wonderful a mother she had been and that I would always be with her no matter what. Continuing to whisper into her ear how strong she was, I encouraged her to fight despite all the odds stacked against her. I had not given up hope yet, as I knew how resilient she was. I challenged her to show everyone how strong she was and to prove them wrong. Though she was confused and fading more each day, she was still able to let me know that she understood my words and she could feel the love around her. And she remarked to me that so many caring things had been said, and for a moment, she looked really happy, and that was incredibly touching. In the midst of my despair and desperate Hail Mary, encouraging her to fight and to survive, I continued to take notes on everything that was going on. I wanted to capture my emotions when they were raw, to properly reflect back in them later. And for a moment or two, I thought about pulling out my laptop and working on the book, but that would have required two hands, and I did not want to let go of Mom with my right hand. Sadly, I wondered if she was ever going to read the new chapters in this book that I was writing, as she had played such an important part in the earlier ones. I had been so emotionally connected to the experience of working on this book with Mom. We had enjoyed reflecting on our journeys together, only to find myself once again immersed in the story as it was unfolding. Also, I wondered if this book was going to have a different ending than the one I had originally planned for, something a little less serious than slowly watching Mom die and grieving her loss. Needing a break after all that intensity, I asked my wife to come in and sit with Mom so I could take a walk to clear my head. For most of the rest of the day, Mom was touch and go. Family members sat beside her weeping and whispering words into her ear, kissing her on the forehead and loving her while lovingly holding her hand. Each of us would have our own private time with Mom and then some group time as well. And we always made sure to have at least one person there at all times so she would never be alone. The nursing staff remarked that it was abundantly clear how much love and support she had. Eventually, most of her friends left, and there were just a few of us who remained there to be with Mom until presumably the end. During my time, I was glued to the monitors, emotionally tormented as before with every tick up and down of her oxygen and heart rates. The nursing staff had told us not to watch the numbers so closely, but rather to focus on how she appeared to be breathing or if she was in discomfort, essentially her visual symptoms. It was vitally important to make sure that her head and torso stayed up as she laid in bed to make it easier for her to breathe. Often I or my siblings would call the nurses in to help Mom get back into place. And each time she was repositioned, her oxygen level would go back up a few more digits. However, moving her seemed to be causing her more and more discomfort each time. So we had to be careful and we had to pick our spots. The next chapter is the source of life. Probably the hardest chapter in the book for me to read, but we're going to fight through it. This is My Battles with Cancer, a patient and caregiver's candid memoir. This is my story of fighting cancer, surviving cancer, and then watching my mother, trying to help my mother as she had cancer and I was a caregiver. I wanted to do this for many years, and I published the book, and I finished the audiobook recently, and then I wanted to do the whole video series for free on YouTube, and that's what I'm doing. So Cheds Trading on YouTube. I published a couple other books, Trading Quotes, Trading Wisdom. Of course, I'm Big Cheds on Twitter. So I will be back with another chapter soon. It's a pretty heavy one. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.